This morning we're going to look at just really a couple verses in the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to bring in one passage from Luke's Gospel. You and I are keenly aware that Jesus gave to his disciples, to his followers, to you and I, what we commonly call the Lord's Prayer, which is the model prayer. But we also find in Jesus the model prayer, one whose relationship with the Father was fueled by his prayer life. And so this morning I want us to look at some elements of Jesus' prayer life and let that be instructive for our own. And again, we're just basically going to focus on one particular passage, one verse really, in Mark's Gospel. But to just give a little context, because we're going to encounter Jesus very early in the morning here in Mark 1:35. The day that preceded that, I've always said Jesus is never in a hurry. That does not mean that Jesus was not busy. The day that preceded Mark 1:35 was a busy day. Jesus began that by teaching in the synagogue that morning. And then he went out in the afternoon and he performed some healings. Word got out about the authority of his teaching, the power of his healings. And then in Mark 1:34, the verse that precedes that, says that all the town showed up at his door. All the town showed up at his door with all the folks that were sick, and Jesus did healing after healing after healing. That is a busy day. Knowing that Jesus was fully human, just as he was fully divine, we can only begin to imagine that from that day, he certainly must have felt exhausted physically. And so it gives a little bit more, for me anyway, impact to what we find here written in Mark 1:35. Very early in the morning, so this is the next day, very early in the morning while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." So he was going to have another very busy day. Everybody is looking for you. And then we're going to kind of bring in at the end here Luke 5:16. The news about Jesus spread all the more, so that the crowds of people came to hear from him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. So again, this morning I want us to think about the prayer life of Jesus. There are four things I want to mention from Mark chapter 1, verse 35, that signal to us, say to us something about Jesus' prayer life. The first is this, that Jesus' prayer life was intentional. You know, I just want to say this. Prayer, having a dynamic, meaningful prayer life, takes work. It takes work. It does not just happen. It is not just something that just kind of flows out. It takes work. It takes commitment. It takes intentionality. And we find here that Jesus' prayer life was marked by a very deep intentionality to it. Mark 1:35 says Jesus got up, and you may say, well, of course he did. It was morning. Everybody gets up. Everybody wakes up. Well, interesting, the word that the Gospel writer Mark uses to talk about Jesus getting up, the verb that he uses there, doesn't mean he woke up. Doesn't mean he just got out of bed. It means that he did something, he arose for a determined purpose. So that's different from just waking up and getting out of bed. That's not what is being described here. He gets up with a determined purpose. There is an intentionality to what Jesus is about to do, what we're going to find out from the remainder of Mark 1:35. Any of you all have an internal alarm clock? I know that I do, and all of us have experienced that phenomenon, where if you go to bed knowing that the next morning you have to be somewhere at a certain point in time, and particularly if it's early in the morning, you might set your alarm clock, but you wake up before the alarm goes on. That's your internal alarm clock. It's like at my house, we have a Sunday morning alarm time, and that is 6:45. And since we started doing the early service at 8:45, I have never awoken to the alarm clock. My internal alarm clock goes off about 6 or 6:15. And I get up and come down, and I'm here about 7:15 or 7:30. I turn the lights on and get the Sunday school rolls out, water the peace lilies. Because if the peace lilies aren't watered, the Trinity does not show up. That's written in Habakkuk somewhere, you can look it up. But all of us have that internal alarm clock, right? If we know we got something to do early that next day, most of us are going to get up before we are physically given an alarm signal. You know, interestingly, there were some academics at a leading university in Germany that studied this phenomenon and really wanted to know if there was such a thing as an internal alarm clock. And so they took a bunch of students, divided them into two groups, and the first group of students were told that they were going to be awakened at 6 a.m. The second group of students were told that they would not have to be up or at it or anything until 9 a.m. And of course, that's still a wake-up time for college students, because college students like to, their alarm is 1 p.m. They're anything like my son's. Interestingly, the group that was told they had to be awake by 6 a.m., the overwhelming majority of them woke up before 6. Didn't have to be, physically awakened. The 9 o'clock group was still snoozing. We do have an internal alarm clock when you and I know we have an appointment. I want to suggest to you this morning that our prayer life needs an internal alarm clock. First century, Jesus didn't have any smartphone or iPhone or alarm clock on the nightstand. This is because Jesus was excited about, Jesus was intentional about, Jesus was determined about having that appointment with God to begin his day. He had an eternal alarm clock. And no matter how busy the day before was, no matter how exhausted he might have gone to bed, no matter how busy the day was in front of him, that eternal alarm clock was a divine appointment that Jesus had. You and I need to be intentional about our prayer life. Second thing that we get from Mark 1:35 is not only was Jesus' prayer life intentional, but that Jesus' prayer life was a priority. Because it said not only did Jesus get up with a determined purpose in mind, in this case it's prayer, but it says that he got up in the morning. Now, some translations will say in the middle of the night. Because most scholars believe that this phrase in the morning does not mean 6 or 6:30. It means more like 4 a.m., 4:30 a.m. So it truly is in the middle of the night that Jesus gets up. And so before he goes about anything else, as important and as critical and as meaningful as all of those other activities were, teaching is important, healing is important, ministry is important. But all of that was secondary to Jesus making prayer the first priority. And that's instructive for me, because you think about the day and age in which we live. Let me tell you what, man, you get up in the morning, I get up in the morning, and so many times what happens is when we get up in the morning, we start powering up all the toys. The smartphone comes up, and the first thing we grab the phone and check weather, and check sports scores, and check Facebook, or whatever we got loaded up on the phone, and that comes on. Next thing you know, psychologically we've engaged in all of that, or maybe we turn the TV on and we watch a little Morning Joe or CNN or the Today Show, and we're getting all the sports and entertainment news, and next thing you know, psychologically we're all invested in that, or there's stuff just that we need to tend to. You with me? If prayer isn't a priority, prayer probably will not make an impact in the day. We'll power up other things, we'll get involved in other things, we'll invest ourselves in other things, and the next thing you know, the day is off and running, and we're other places and doing other things, and prayer has been put on the back burner. Jesus got up. Prayer was intentional. In the middle of the night, early in the morning, prayer was a priority. Third, Mark 1:35 says he left the house. Jesus' prayer life was without distraction. Jesus left the house. The word that's being used here for leaving means not only physically, not only did he go outside somewhere to pray, but it also means to leave the house psychologically. To leave whatever's going to face him that day, leave whatever's going on in the house, leave whoever is in the house, just kind of set that to the side for a moment, and to truly give undivided attention to being with God. And you know, sometimes you and I can leave a place and not leave a place. Sometimes we can leave work, but we haven't left work. Are you with me? Work comes with you. And so when it says here that Jesus left the house, it means that he psychologically checked out from the house and all the folks and all the activities of the house to give focus to being in conversation with God. And if you and I are to truly have a meaningful prayer life, it means that you and I need to have that time alone with God where truly we have checked out of everything else that will draw our attention away, and we have focused upon God. We have focused upon God. Fourth, says not only did he leave the house, but he went off to a solitary place. Jesus' prayer life was an intimate conversation. Now that doesn't mean that from time to time in the Gospels that we don't find Jesus engaging in what we might call corporate prayer. Certainly when Jesus was in the synagogue, he prayed with the people of God. Nothing wrong with that. It's very powerful. Does not mean that Jesus didn't pray with his disciples and his inner circle of friends. Certainly he did that. And demonstrated prayer to them and with them. So Jesus often participated in group prayer, whether in the synagogue or with the disciples or with the multitudes. But we also find that time and time again, it is written in the gospel record that Jesus sought an alone place, a solitary place to be with God. And I just want to say something to you this morning. If the only prayer life you have is when you come to church and we happen to pray here, that's not going to be meaningful. Not because prayer and worship isn't important, it is. But that alone cannot feed you and cannot feed me in terms of having an intimate conversation with God. And so many times Jesus would set the disciples to the side, the multitudes, the healings, the teaching, the synagogue activity to the side, and go and seek God in a solitary place. I want you to ask yourself this morning, where is your solitary place where you encounter God's presence? Where you can have intimate conversation with Him, where you can say things to God that no one else needs to hear. But you need to say that to God in that solitary place. To have that conversation. When I was in seminary, all of us had to take an introductory course to pastoral counseling. And one of the elements to that course was, how do you have a good conversation? Now you may think, well, what do you mean, how do you have a good conversation? All of us kind of know how to talk with each other. Well, let me suggest to you, that's not necessarily true. There are elements to what comprises a good and meaningful conversation. Because we can have conversations and really not ever say anything. You with me? So this morning I want to just kind of lift from that little course 5 things that I learned about what is a good conversation. And I want us to kind of bring those in to thinking about our prayer life and the elements of having that intimate, solitary conversation with God that can become meaningful and impactful. So these 5 elements of a really good conversation, I want you to think about them in application to prayer. One is you get out of yourself. You know, if you're going to have a really good conversation with another person, and when we're talking about prayer, of course, that means with God, it means it's not your agenda. Your agenda is not the top priority of good conversation. And so we kind of have to just set our agenda to the side. We just have to get out of ourselves and say, you know what? This moment, this conversation is not going to be about me. But I am truly going to focus upon God. So we have to get out of ourselves. Secondly, we have to practice active listening. Have you ever had this experience where you've been in conversation with somebody and you can tell they're not listening to a word you're saying? Right? All of us have had those moments, and all of us have probably been on the sending side of that equation when somebody's saying something to us and we're just somewhere else. You know what I'm saying? So there is a difference between just kind of passive listening and active listening, where you are truly concentrating upon what that other person is trying to communicate to you. And that is true in prayer conversation, that you and I are actively engaged, intentional about seeking from God what He has to say to us. Third element is go to a deeper level. You know, so much of the conversations that sometimes you and I have are very, very surfacey. You know, we might pass someone in the hallway here at church or at work or at school and say, hey, how you doing? And they'll say, fine, how are you? Well, they're good. And, you know, we just kind of keep going. Right? That's a conversation, but it's not a good conversation. It's not a meaningful conversation. Not a deep conversation. Good conversations, meaningful conversations, go deep. Go deep. You know that there's a passage of Scripture that describes prayer this way, of deep speaking to deep. Where the depths of who you are and who I am connect with, experience the depth of God's presence. Deep speaking unto deep. Fourth element is ask good questions. Ask good questions. You know, I've said this before, and it bears repeating. God does not get upset with our questions. God does not get angry with our questions. God does not get intimidated with our questions. God does not want to punish us if we ask some questions. God doesn't get disappointed if we have questions. In fact, God invites our questions. And if you don't think God doesn't invite questions and want to deal with your questions, you know, just read the book of Job. Read some of the Psalms. Read some of those great men and women of the Bible who went before God and just put it all out there, and their questions and their doubts and their concerns, and wanting to know where He was and why they hadn't heard from Him and what was going on. Man, the Bible is full of good questions, asked by a believer to the Heavenly Father. Don't ever be afraid. Don't ever feel ashamed. Don't ever think God's going to be disappointed in you if you have questions. Ask Him. Ask Him. Fifth element of a good conversation is complete attention. It is space and time considerations. It means that, again, you've left the house. That you are truly at a place and in a moment where your complete focus and attention is on God, and you just set distractions to the side. Now, those 5 things on the screen are good for human conversations. I want to suggest to you this morning that they are also good elements for a prayer conversation. When we go to that solitary place where we can encounter intimately the presence of God and just be with Him, and and be before Him, just as Jesus did so many times in the course of His ministry. Now we're going to bring in Luke 5:16. Because the last thing I want to share with you about Jesus' prayer life was that it was consistent. It was consistent. Luke 5:16 says, "But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." You know what? If the only time we pray is when we're in crisis, that's not consistency. If the only time we pray is when we just kind of are celebrating something, we're giving thanks, that's not consistency. Consistency means that with a determined purpose and at a solitary place and having an intimate conversation is done on a regular basis. And so when we think about all the demands that are placed upon Jesus, all the things He could do, and there's something powerful if you can heal people. I can tell you right now, if I could, through just touch, heal people, I'd be racing down to Roanoke Memorial Hospital right now. Jesus could do that. If I could speak truth in such a way that it would just completely transform people's lives and put them in a new direction, I'd just wake up and start teaching. Jesus could do that. But Luke 5:16 says, but Jesus often went to lonely places and prayed. That was a consistency to His prayer life. When you and I think about what it is that Jesus set aside in order to pray, what more important things could we have in our life that would trump prayer? I conclude with this statement I've made before. God does not call us to ministry. God calls us to intimacy. When we are intimate with God, then all these other things, ministry, service, calling, virtue, is the overflow of the intimacy. Jesus knew that, desired that, practiced that, modeled that. And so this morning, all the things that you could do as a believer, know this. The most important thing you and I can do is to seek intimacy with God in prayer before His presence. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we find in Jesus the supreme perfect example of prayer, of a prayer who was intentional, who prioritized prayer, who went to places where there were not distractions, who had intimate conversation with you, and who did that on a regular basis. Because it was intimacy with the Father that fueled and empowered and directed everything else in His life. So, Lord, may we know that. May we embrace that. May we practice that. In Jesus' name, one who went to solitary places and prayed, we now pray.